Good morning, everyone. Oh, I don't know if it's true. I guess it's just noon. Yeah. Sorry about that. Happy noon, everybody. Is anybody familiar with Ladysmith Black Mambazo? That's the ensemble, couple of hands. Yeah. This song in particular, does it ring a bell with anybody? All right, quick quiz. Which well-known artist did they? Paul Simon, exactly. So this song, what we just heard, would have been released in 1986 on the album Graceland, right? So Paul Simon really helped to launch the career of Ladysmith Black Mambazo, which is largely a family ensemble that sing a cappella music, born out of the experiences and lives and stories of folks in South Africa. So the reason why I begin with that song to kind of center us in this space is twofold. Number one, because in 1986, when Paul Simon releases Graceland, that gives us a great frame of reference for when the Belhar Confession was officially adopted by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church in South Africa. So that gives you a time frame that a lot of this is taking place. The other reason why I want to begin with that, and I noticed last week as I watched Lynette's class online that she offered her instruction in her robe. And I thought that that was really significant because when we approach our Reformed confessions, we have to realize that we are simultaneously doing three things, right? We're doing worship, so we are doing doxology. These are liturgical documents, and that's why we utilize them in the context of our Reformed worship service. Secondly, we're doing the work of orthodoxy, right? This is what largely we believe. These are the guidelines, the buoys that frame in how we understand our Reformed tradition. And lastly, we are doing orthopraxis. So especially for the confessions of the 20th century, these documents coming out of specific historical contexts in which the church is trying to respond to needs at the moment, urgencies of the moment, imperatives of the moment. These are telling us how we ought to be moving in the world in light of our faith if our worship is to be in any way authentic. So we hold those three modes of being as we enter into this space together. Now, as with any confessional document, it is critical that we have a sense of the historical context out of which they are born. So thinking back, for those of you who joined Kyle Nolan or who heard Lynette, whether it's our ancient creeds or the Barmen Declaration that arises out of Germany and Europe during the rise of nationalism, specifically Nazism, or the Confession of 67, which I heard so many of you name everything that was happening in the late 60s in our country. That context is just as important, I would say, as the words that make it onto the paper, because they provide us with the interpretive framework. So when I first studied the Belhar Confession, it was at Calvin Theological Seminary. At that point, Neil Plantinga was teaching our Reformed Creeds and Confessions class. And although this has not yet landed as an official confession of the Christian Reformed Church of North America, he felt like it needed equal airtime in the class to the three forms of unity within the Christian Reformed Church. And we'll touch on those in a minute. But the way that he brought us into conversation with this document, he taught it over two classes. The first class, we watched about an hour-long documentary about the brutal realities of apartheid in South Africa. And I remember Neil standing there saying, we're going to watch this documentary and respond in the only way that is appropriate and sacred, which is silence. So when this documentary concludes, we will leave from this space and hold what we have seen and come back next time prayerfully ready to approach these words. I wasn't given two classes. So what I'm about to show you all is adapted from TEDx that just gives us a little, again, I don't want to assume that folks have a framework of understanding of the timeline of apartheid, of what all that means, where that word comes from. So we're just going to watch a quick, I think it's like 6-minute clip that just sort of orients us to what was happening in South Africa that gave birth to the urgency for this powerful, powerful document. And I will just say that a lot of what we'll be talking about this morning can be heavy. I think the Belhar, much like Ladysmith Black Mumbazo, speaks about pain, suffering, agony, always with the lens of both acknowledging truth, but also holding fast to hope and joy. And I think the Belhar does that beautifully. That said, we have to grapple with some pretty heavy stuff. So if for whatever reason you need to come up for air and leave for a moment, that's okay. I don't think anything I have is too graphic in any way, but it's still heavy, and I want to honor how that lands on folks' bodies. So let's take a look at this.
On June 16, 1976, over 10,000 student protesters flooded the streets of Soweto, South Africa. For 28 years, South Africans had been living under apartheid, a strict policy of segregation that barred the country's black majority from skilled, high-paying jobs, quality education, and much more. And in 1974, the government announced schools would be forced to teach many subjects in Afrikaans, a language used primarily by the nation's white ruling elites. But when protesters rose up to fight this injustice, the government's response was swift. Armed police officers turned their weapons onto the crowd, and over the following days they killed over 150 students, including victims as young as 13. Even before apartheid, South Africa's long history of racial violence had already cost countless black Africans their jobs, homes, and lives. Beginning in the 1600s, first Dutch and later British settlers colonized the nation, displacing local populations from their ancestral lands. Over the following centuries, black Africans were segregated onto so-called native reserves. And by the 20th century, that meant 70% of the population was living on roughly 13% of the country's land. Deprived of their traditional livelihoods and seeking to escape these overpopulated regions, black Africans began migrating to white-controlled areas. There, they worked for low wages on white-owned farms and mines, alongside the descendants of enslaved and indentured workers from across Africa and Asia. By 1948, this exploited labor force was a primary driver of South Africa's booming economy. But economists argued that continued growth required a stable, educated, and urbanized African labor force. The ruling United Party accepted this logic, but the rival National Party argued such a workforce would threaten the white ruling class, naming their campaign apartheid, the Afrikaans word for separateness. The National Party won the 1948 elections. And once in power, they began forcibly relocating millions of Africans back to the reserves. Under apartheid, black workers were considered temporary visitors in white areas. They were restricted to specific zones, and their trade unions received no official recognition. The government also abolished mixed-race universities, outlawed mixed marriages, segregated recreational spaces, and purged the non-white population from the voters' roll. Within Parliament at this time, apartheid only had a small group of outspoken opponents, but outside the government, 3 political groups were leading a popular resistance against the regime. The Communist Party, which was then legally banned in 1950, their allies in the African National Congress, and later, a splinter group called the Pan-Africanist Congress. Despite some ideological differences, all 3 groups worked to mobilize the masses against apartheid by non-violent methods. But the National Party wasn't as restrained. On March 21st, 1960, policemen massacred demonstrators at a PAC rally. And within weeks, the ANC and PAC were outlawed. These events radicalized anti-apartheid leaders. And in December of 1961, Nelson Mandela and other ANC and Communist Party activists established the resistance's armed wing. While the conflict grew increasingly violent, The 1960s saw consistent economic growth throughout South Africa. The National Party attributed this to the success of apartheid, but it was actually due to further exploitation. Employers were illegally hiring black laborers for positions affluent white workers didn't want to fill. And since this prosperity was flowing disproportionately to the ruling white minority, the government happily turned a blind eye. Meanwhile, the National Party leveraged global anti-communist sentiment to demonize its adversaries. In 1963, they tried Mandela and 10 others for advancing communism and training recruits in guerrilla warfare. 8 of the defendants were sentenced to life in prison, and many remaining anti-apartheid leaders were forced into exile. Over the next decade, a generation of student activists rose up to continue the fight, led in part by Steve Biko and the South African Students' Organization. Following the Soweto massacre, student protesters spread nationwide, but police violently smothered these demonstrations, killing over 600 protesters by early 1977. That same year, Biko was taken into police custody and killed in a brutal assault. In response to this violence, the international community finally called for an end to apartheid, with some countries enacting trade embargoes against South Africa. The state attempted to launch a reform process, creating separate parliaments for the country's white, non-white, and Indian populations. But the exclusion of the African majority led to more nationwide rioting. So when F.W. de Klerk, a longtime supporter of apartheid, came to power in 1989, he concluded the only way to ensure white survival was to end the policy. On February 2nd, 1990, de Klerk shocked the world by unbanning the ANC, releasing Mandela, and calling for constitutional negotiations. 4 years later, in the nation's inaugural all-inclusive elections, Mandela became South Africa's first black president. But today, the national trauma of apartheid can still be keenly felt, and many wounds from this period have yet to fully heal. Nelson Mandela once said, "No single person can liberate a country. You can only liberate a country if you act as a collective." So, how can ordinary citizens turn actions like protests into lasting political change? Find out how with this video.
So before we get to this slide, what stands out to you from that video we just watched? Things you noticed?
Brutality.
Brutality,
Discrimination.
discrimination.
Similar to white colonial behavior all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point, Jeff. I want to return to that in just a quick second. Yeah.
Persistence.
Persistence.
And hope.
Yep, absolutely. As you were watching the images, and you heard this language that was being talked about, did this sound like very familiar to all of you, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what's really profound about Belhar, is just how much it speaks to our current context. To Jeff's point, you're going to hear me mention several times the Dutch Reformed Church. And you're going to hear me talk about the 3 forms of unity. And I want to be clear because I'm mindful of the spiritual and denominational heritages that make up our congregation, right? Though denominationally related, we are not talking about the Christian Reformed Church or the Reformed Church in America. And I would even go as far as to say that the similarities in our relatedness across the Reformed family place us just in as much close proximity to the Dutch Reformed Church as anyone else. And I think as we look at Barmen, we'll see that it is very much holding up a mirror to us as much as anyone else. So I just want to say that I'm not calling anybody out, right? This is us talking about what this means for us. So, that kind of gives you a national landscape. In terms of what the church was navigating in this season, racial segregation was just everywhere. And you see up there that even the church itself was divided almost into 4 different contexts. The Dutch Reformed Mission Church, out of which we will receive the Belhar Confession, is the lowest tier of what was undoubtedly a church-based caste system of segregation. Despite the fact that all 4 of these churches shared Dutch Reformed roots and Afrikaner culture, there was still a strict division, segregation, based upon racial makeup in South Africa in this time. So, what's really messed up here is that the Dutch Reformed Church had really bent over backwards to utilize theology, scripture, teaching, the current confessions to justify this, right? To say that somehow these formal policies of apartheid were in fact necessary or justified, leaning into our Reformed roots. And you can see there the disparity there. So as we look at the 3 standards of unity, which within the wider Reformed world generally refer to the Heidelberg Catechism, the Canons of Dort, and the Belgic Confession, these largely arise also out of a context, 16th and 17th century Europe, where they're trying to say, hey, listen, we Protestants, we're not anarchists. We're not bad guys here. We are citizens and we are willing to obey, despite the fact that we believe things a little bit differently than, say, our Roman Catholic counterparts. Well, in the 19th and 20th century South Africa, the narrative on that is turned a little bit, right? You must obey a government that imposes segregation. That is what it means to be faithful, to submit to white dominance. The scandalous absence in the 3 standards of unity is a confession on justice. The significant contribution that Belhar adds in complementing the existing standards is its explicit confession of faith in the God of justice. The Confession of Belhar closes a loophole in the Reformed confessions by coming to terms with the revelation of God about the realities of social justice. This is from Russell Botman, who, co-writer of the Belhar Confession, jailed, beaten, brutalized in the process of writing this very confession. He writes, and you'll see the confession echo this: God, in a special way, revealed as the God of those who suffer, especially of those who suffer as a result of poverty and injustices. So it's important to remember that in the Dutch Reformed Church, at this time, they're not working with the same confessional repertoire that we are in the Presbyterian Church. So while at this point we have the Confession of 1967 and the Barmen Declaration, they largely do not. So the Belhar is the first step towards a confessional document that really brings justice to the fore of the theological conversation. So in 1982, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches actually declares apartheid a heresy, like a theological heresy. This system, this way of being, runs contrary to the gospel, right? And this is what I think is so powerful about the Belhar Confession. It's not just saying what we believe, but in also talking about what we reject. And you'll see that as we look at it. It is decrying what it sees as theological and spiritual abuses perpetuated by the church. In other words, it's calling out the church for violating the gospel. So again, WARC, as it's called, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, elevates apartheid as a status confessionalist. I don't know if that's how you actually say it, but that's how I say it. It sounds fancy. The gospel is at stake here. If justification of apartheid was not abandoned, the Dutch Reformed Church ceased to be a true church in the eyes of this larger global body. This is not insignificant. So at this point, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, largely empowered by this global declaration, both of heresy and condemnation of the Dutch Reformed Church, appoints a committee led by Botman and Smith to draft an appropriate expression of their judgment on apartheid. There you can see the original version of it. Now this became known as the Confession of Belhar for the suburb of Cape Town, where this synod was meeting. So during the first 4 years of discussion from 1982 to 86, several of the writers suffered severely. Botman himself, as I mentioned, was jailed and tortured. The confession was attacked as a communist document. What is also revealing to me and to us isn't, again, just the words on the page, but the way in which those words were received or rejected by the church. And that includes our own denomination, right? So this journey, again, it's significant and worth paying attention to. So written in the mid-80s, the writers had no expectation. This is, I think, is really key. No expectation that apartheid was going to end, right? So Smith writes, it was too totalitarian, too powerful. So the words you read on the page of this confession were written in a time period where a solution, resolution, peace, justice were not in sight. And that's where I bring up the importance of hope as we look at this confession. So in 1986, again, same year that Paul Simon releases Graceland, this gets adopted as a confession of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. And the United Reformed Church of South Africa, which succeeded that and brings together two denominations, they gift us this confession. Believing that the themes of unity, reconciliation, and justice, they issue us a call from God to the whole church towards holy action, transformation, and life. So we have to see apartheid as the context for this document, although it is never mentioned in the confession. This is the brilliance of the authorship here. The words don't hold us in a particular time and place, though they are very much born out of a particular time and place. And because of that, the ability of that confession, not just to speak truth, but I would go as far as to say to indict us as the church. I think that impact will last for many generations. So it lifts up the gospel as a bringer of hope. Again, we have to understand that this document, first and foremost, is about the hope, the joy, the unity that we have in God through Christ. It prevents a Christian view of racism, separation, segregation, suffering by those who have experienced those realities. And it demonstrates that confessional affirmations can in fact arise from social ethics. That is to say, we can see what is wrong in the world and develop theology. We can develop a framework of orthodoxy that speaks to that. Orthodoxy and orthopraxis in conversation with one another. It's a protest document with three central points: unity, reconciliation, and justice. So where do we see this in conversation with our other confessions? Well, it's perhaps most similar to the Theological Declaration of Barmen. And this is why our snowstorm actually serves us well, because originally I was supposed to be presenting on this before Lynette offered to you her teaching on Barmen and C67. I really think you have to have a base understanding of Barmen to see why we believe and we reject is an important structure that mirrors that earlier document. Again, the histories, though different, are very resonant in their context. There is a little bit of a dash of the Heidelberg Catechism right at the beginning of this confession, hearkening to Lord's Day 21 for those who are familiar, that asks about how we understand the universal church, the Catholic Christian Church, I think is the way that wording goes. And it has strong resonance with the Confession of 67 in terms of its leaning into reconciliation. although I could not find instances where there was somebody who was working with C67 as they were drafting the Belhar Confession, if that makes sense. They're definitely working with Barment Declaration, and I think they have some nods to the three forms of unity as they're writing this. So what are the differences? It's definitely shorter. There's only 5 sections. It's unique and it emerges from, this is crazy to me. So it emerges from a mission church, right? And the document itself is meant to say, we as a church should not exist like this. The very nature that we have this thing called the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, where there is a Dutch Reformed church, that is blasphemous. That is heresy. That runs contrary to the gospel. So I don't know how many other confessions exist to say we as a church should not exist like this. But it's a profound, profound statement of Confession of Belhar. So this is where I want to get into the document itself. I printed out a couple copies if you can reference it. I have excerpts up on the slide, so no worries if you don't have a copy in front of you. So it begins with a very Trinitarian opening. We believe in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who gathers and protects and cares for the church through Word and Spirit. This God has done since the beginning of the world and will do until the end. Again, very resonant with Lord's Day 21 from Heidelberg Catechism. We believe in one holy universal Christian church, the communion of saints called from the entire human family. This affirms the relationship of the Trinity to the church, how the Trinity demonstrates to us unity and harmony. What is profoundly humbling about this document, and I think what is most challenging for us in our context, I don't actually think it's the justice piece, although that's big. I don't think it's the reconciliation piece, although that's big. It's the unity piece, right? So let me ask this question. What do folks see as barriers to unity in the church today? And I realize that is a massive question, but I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts?
Abortion rights.
Okay, right to life, abortion rights, absolutely. Others?
Race is still an issue.
Huge issue.
I think there's a division between that element of Christianity that is focused on the individual and the individual's relation to God and salvation.
Sure.
And that branch of Christianity that is focused on looking outward toward serving other people and looking at justice.
Yep.
I think, and there ought to be a happy medium in there somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
but there seems to be a division in focus.
Yeah. So like, how we theologically understand who is centered and who's supposed to be doing what in the world. Yeah, others.
Worship styles are different.
Okay, worship styles, absolutely.
The focus on differences rather than what we have in common.
Mhm. You know, I would say I fall victim to this as well, where, I'll just say candidly, I was asked by some colleagues at Grand Valley if I would be willing to speak to a Christian professor who has put out some very harmful things online surrounding the LGBTQI community. And my response was, you know, because I graduated from Calvin Theological Seminary, so like to some degree I've been down that road before in those conversation spaces. And I would say, like, that's something that has to be born out of deep relationship. And as somebody who does interfaith dialogue, that conversation, even which is interfaith, right? I'm dialoguing with it. That feels just as foreign to me, and in some cases more foreign than conversations I have with my Muslim or Buddhist counterparts. Like inter-Christian conversation feels like interfaith dialogue. We have become that divided. Belhar does not let us off the hook. And in the supporting documents, which we'll talk about in a minute, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church does not wish ill will on the Dutch Reformed Church. They actually wish to be united with them. They wish for healing for both of them together. It's profoundly humbling.
I think one thing that still causes divisiveness in the church today is, as a society, we're evolving from churches that strongly believed in division of church and state into a secular society that pounces upon political divisiveness, and everyone carries with them their old political allegiances from the past. And so it causes a friction internally among people in the church. And many people still believe you don't get involved, the church doesn't get involved, yet many churches do.
Exactly. And so two things there. Number one, I think we have to see that ultimately the gospel is political. It may not be partisan, but it's absolutely political. We make claims like Christ is Lord. That's a very political statement. We use words like gospel, which in their historical context would have been subversive to language used by the emperor of the day. And so when we look at a document like Belhar, we see that Christian teaching is incompatible with imperialism, nationalism, capitalism, and individualism. And to me, that deeply disrupts how a lot of people understand themselves as Christians, specifically living in the United States. Like, the idea of the United States as a Christian nation is incredibly oxymoronic in terms of how we understand what it means to be Christian, what it means to live in light of the gospel and submit entirely to the lordship of Jesus Christ. So we move into this unity statement of the document. And one thing that I want to pull out for you here, feel welcome to glance in your papers or read what is up there, talking about the gift and obligation of unity, right? One which the people of God must continually build up and attain. That section that I have underlined, that true faith in Jesus Christ is the only condition for membership in the church. That's almost verbatim what we find in the Book of Order in the so part 2 of our Constitution around church membership. And you're going to see when we get to the reject language part of this, the other half of that statement. This unity must become visible so that the world may believe that separation, enmity, and hatred between people and groups is sin, which Christ has already conquered. And accordingly, that anything which threatens this unity may have no place in the church and must be resisted. I mean, the severity of this language is striking to me. We cannot be healthy if we are not pursuing unity.
Is there any thought that Mandela would already be in this stew or the mixed reform people, that they have a more realistic view of how life should be than anybody else? He didn't just go to prison forever and then have transformation at the end of his imprisonment.
Yeah.
It seemed like that might have been a context within their community that they were not going to, I mean, they didn't choose to destroy everybody
Right.
when they became the power, but it seemed like that was undergirding his belief for a long time or something.
Yeah, that's a good question, Bert. You know, it makes me think, how many folks have engaged with, like, Robin Kimmerer's work, Braiding Sweetgrass, right? I think that book does a really great job of illuminating how dissonant the spiritual orientation towards one another and the earth is from how we operate as a country today, right? Like, it is completely different. The Native American framework for understanding human connectedness as that relates to connection with the earth, I think that's also true in this context. So, like, how many are familiar with the term Ubuntu? Ubuntu. Yep. So Ubuntu is a philosophy that really finds its home across the African continent, but especially in South Africa. If you are familiar with Arch's work, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Ubuntu is kind of woven throughout his whole life and practice. Ubuntu is a philosophy that simply says, I am because you are. This is language that's resonant with Dr. King's work. So when he talks about the web of mutuality, the single garment of destiny, I think it's getting at the same idea. I do not exist apart from you. My wealth, prosperity, health, well-being, all of these are very much bound up in yours. And so to your question, Bert, this philosophy is the wrong word, so please, I apologize for using it, but this philosophy, this deep way of moving and being in the world is native to the land. And so I feel like for those who are native to the land, that's the framework through which they operate. And that is coming in direct conflict and, war with colonial powers that are moving in with a framework of exploitation. Talked about the mines, right, and the wealth, the national wealth that was generated from those mines. The wealthiest person in the world largely got a jump start because his dad owned one of those mines, right? Like, large amounts of wealth to be gained from subjugating people. And this should be very familiar to us here in the United States, right? But it is radically opposed to the deeply human framework of connection that is native to the land. And I think that's true for our continent, our place as well. So like I said, each of these three sections begins with we believe and therefore we reject. So we reject any doctrine which absolutizes either natural diversity or the sinful separation of people in such a way that this absolutization hinders or breaks the visible and active unity of the church, or even leads to the establishment of a separate church formation. Again, we should not exist as a church like we do. Which denies that a refusal earnestly to pursue this visible unity as a priceless gift is sin. Which explicitly or implicitly maintains that decent or any other human or social factors should be a consideration in determining membership in the church. They'll use language like to do that is to commit an affront to the person of Jesus Christ. And again, that is consistent with language that we have in the second part of our Constitution, the Book of Order. And I love that they lead with unity, because at the end of the day, this is what they are moving towards. This is what they feel the gospel is calling us towards. To get there, we have to go through reconciliation. That God has entrusted us to His church, the message of reconciliation in and through Jesus Christ. Again, very consistent with language we find in the Confession of 67. That any teaching which attempts to legitimate such forced separation by appeal to the gospel and is not prepared to venture on the road of obedience and reconciliation, but rather out of prejudice, fear, selfishness, and unbelief, denies in advance the reconciling power of the gospel, must be considered ideology and false doctrine. Like, this is not light stuff. Prejudice, fear, selfishness, unbelief. These run contrary to what we hold to be true. So therefore, we reject any doctrine which in such situations sanctions the name of the gospel or the will of God, the forced separation of people on the grounds of race and color, and therefore in advance obstructs and weakens the ministry and experience of reconciliation in Christ. When you move like this through the world, pretending to be the church, you don't only undermine what it means to be the church, you actually work against it. I mean, it doesn't use this word, but read between the lines. To uphold these systems of segregation, of imbalances of power, is to be implicitly anti-Christ. That's what Belhar is saying. So this document has not been widely accepted. Todd Billings out of Western Theological Seminary has a book out, which by and large I appreciate, is called Unity in Christ. But in it, he takes issue with the Belhar Confession, and largely that revolves around this section. We believe that God, in a world full of injustice and enmity, is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged. You see how people are reacting to like Taylor Swift being at the Super Bowl. Like, this is on a whole new level, that line. Like, the amount of airtime that has gotten in the conversation, whether or not that is theologically appropriate to put in a confession, is still hotly contested. I'm curious, that line in particular, the second bullet point down, how does that land with you? What are your thoughts or reactions to that?
It fits into the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
Couldn't hear what he said.
He said, sorry, the comment was, it fits into the Sermon on the Mount very well.
Okay.
Doesn't fit very well with capitalism.
Yes. Others?
I agree with it, 100%.
I just was also screwed.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, because I'm not destitute or the wrong, and I am not wealthy, but I am wealthy in a global sense. And I'm so privileged in everything that I do, like no matter what, and it's like, how do you, when it comes down to brass tacks, how do you really grapple with that other than, to like completely, to do a 180,
Yeah.
it's tough work. And nothing that anyone would really understand in, in your world, like
Yeah.
just, okay, I'm gonna like move on to the street.
Yeah.
It sort of brings to mind the quote, I don't remember who said it, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but the idea that equality or equity for the oppressed often feels like oppression to the privileged.
Oppression to the privileged. That'll ruffle some feathers.
So this comes from Isaiah. Does Isaiah have other things to say?
Isaiah's got a lot to say.
42, 1 through 7 is on the page here. I'm just wondering.
So when it comes to justice-seeking work, Isaiah is very rich. I tend to jump to Isaiah 58, which is the prophet talking about the holy fast, and essentially saying that if you have widows who are uncared for among you, if you have those who are hungry, go take care of them. Otherwise, what you're doing here is meaningless, right? I read that second bullet point, and I feel myself in the position of the rich young man or the rich young ruler, depending on what gospel story. I mean, I have like 10 years of theological education, right? I feel like I try my best to walk with God. I'm a student of His Word. I try to do my best, and yet, like, Jesus, what do I have to do to be perfect? And dude turns around and tells me, sell everything you own and give it to the poor. And so, like the rich young man, we go away sad. We go away heartbroken because it's a threshold that largely we're unwilling to cross. But for me, and this is why initiatives like Matthew 25 are significant, right? It upends how we understand Christian service, support, love, and care. I think there's a lot of harmful theology out there that says when we go and we offer food to somebody who is hungry, we are being Christ to them. Like we are the representation of the provider divinity, but this line upends that. Like, why do we seek communion? Why do we seek community? Why do we seek to care for folks who are just radically outside of our frame of experience? It's because in that relationship we find the person of Jesus Christ. Like, we need that individual for our own work of sanctification. Like salvation, this is a communal effort, and I think Belhar welcomes us into that, right? God's heart is nearest the suffering. I mean, this document and Jürgen Moltmann have saved my faith over and over and over again. I mean, his work on crucified God, the way that he understands atonement, and where God is in instances of human suffering, that's profound to me. Because if this is not true, it's really hard to look at Gaza right now and believe that God is in any way merciful or powerful. So to me, I really feel like that second bullet point is at the heart of this confession, and it was perhaps most challenging to me. Yes?
We've been talking about destitute, poor, and wronged in terms of economic situations, and I think that's obviously important. I look at it as a psychologist, psychotherapist, and look at destitute, poor, and wronged as the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Those parts of ourselves that have been excluded and oppressed.
Yep.
And we all have that piece. So there's cross-cultural, cross-personality, economic ways to identify with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, like I think to situate that in our current cultural context, like there are aspects of ourselves that we either are forced to hide or choose to hide because they run contrary to that which is productive, right? Or that which would allow us to advance or navigate in our culture. This document brings us into a place where we are challenged to be our whole selves. This last bullet point, that the church as the possession of God, church as the possession of God, not the possessor of God, must stand where the Lord stands, namely against injustice with the wrong. That in following Christ, the church must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interests and thus control and harm others. This calls us into what I would consider to be radically uncomfortable work. In the diversity and equity inclusion world, we like to parse out the difference between what it means to be an ally and an accomplice, right? That is to say, I can put a pride flag on my house, I can put a Black Lives Matter sign in my yard, and to some degree I feel like I have done my job of being in solidarity with people because I've done that. Now, I don't want to dismiss the fact that in some context that is incredibly risk-taking behavior. I don't want to dismiss that. But to be an accomplice is to move ourselves into a situation where our allyship will cost us something, right? It costs us economically, it costs us socially, maybe it even costs us physically. We have to put something on the line, the accomplice thing, right? To be an accomplice with somebody is to be able to be indicted for that which they are doing. And in the world of disrupting the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interests and thus control and harm others, that is all around us. And oftentimes, I think justice-seeking work, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're showing up in spaces where we are surrounded by persons of color, or we're surrounded by the most marginalized. For us, for most of us, I feel like that involves showing up in spaces where we're surrounded by people who look a lot like us. And we are speaking truths that will not be received well in that space. Because we have access to those spaces, because we have voices that are permitted to speak into the conversation in those spaces. And friends, that is risk-taking behavior for us. And that's what this is calling us to. To step up in those spaces where we know we feel uncomfortable, and that, friends, may very well be your dining room table. It may be the boardroom. So therefore, in light of how we understand justice, we reject any doctrine which would legitimate forms of injustice, and any doctrine which is unwilling to resist such an ideology in the name of the gospel. The confession concludes as follows. We believe that in obedience to Jesus Christ, its only head, the church is called to confess and to do these things, even through the authorities and human laws, even though the authorities and human laws might forbid them and punish them, and suffering be the consequences. Jesus is Lord. To the one and only God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, be the honor and the glory forever. So if Christ is sovereign, if Christ rules over the whole church, if Christ is Lord of all of us, and we are held in grace, we have the ability to move into that work that might be forbidden by law, that might cause us or others to face punishment or suffer. This is not an easy document to sit with as persons of privilege. I'll just say that. It is immensely challenging on an individual and collective level. So as we look at the Presbyterian Church's relationship with the Belhar Confession, I know there's been a lot of conversation in this congregation in terms of how we relate to the Odawa people, how we understand our physicalness in this place, this West Michigan place that was land that still very much belongs to the Anishinaabe people. The conversation around Belhar and the Presbyterian Church largely began in committees that were looking at reparations and land acknowledgments, because this document seemed to speak a whole lot of truth for us in our relationship to the Native community. So what's crazy to me is that the Advocacy Committee for Racial and Ethnic Concerns proposed this all the way back in 2024. 2004. Yes, thank you. Not this year. In 2024. And yet, it did not get adopted until 2016. In fact, it failed to meet the vote at least once, maybe twice. And in one case, around 2012, it had already failed to meet the threshold before the National Presbytery in D.C. had a chance to vote on it. And they were outraged by this because it is one of the most diverse presbyteries in our nation, and they didn't get to weigh in on it. And so they largely pulled together an overture to propose this to be reconsidered. And the Presbyterian launched, maybe you remember this, around 2011, 2012, this whole campaign to provide education around what the Belhar was. There were brochures that went around that had talking points for folks that answered questions like, is the Belhar biblical? The Belhar is not Christological. The Belhar doesn't really speak to us because it addresses another country or culture. Unfortunately, I heard this a lot at seminary, that we have to be wary of liberation theology, of feminist theology, of womanist theology, of queer theology, of theology arising from the global south, because it is not objective. As if there could be such a thing, or as if Kuyper and Bavinck and Berkhoff and Calvin were somehow operating from an objective standpoint, right? The Book of Confessions is large enough as it is.
That's persuasive.
Yep. And the Belhar is pushing the acceptance of gay marriage and ordination. Again, this is in the 2012-2011 time frame when that conversation was at the fore of our denomination. This document makes no mention of that. Is it relevant? Can you make extensions to marginalized communities who have oppressed and suffered? Yes. But the Belhar largely got bound up in that conversation. I mean, again, I was a part of a Presbyterian church in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, that ended up leaving the denomination after an incredibly toxic 2-year discernment process. And I remember them talking about how unorthodox this document was, because it was yet another step to promote gay marriage and undermine our theology of atonement in the church. Right? There's a discontinuity with how we understand orthodoxy. The Special Committee on the Confession of Belhar recommended that the Presbyterian Church USA add Belhar as a part of its constitution because it believed the clarity of Belhar's witness to unity, reconciliation, and justice might help the PCUSA speak and act with similar clarity at a time when it faces division, racism, and injustice. Included in your packets, you'll see there's the confession, which has its 5 parts. And then there are 2 documents called the accompanying letters. I want to be mindful of our time. So, in most copies of the Book of Confession, you will absolutely see the first accompanying letter, which was a statement made upon the adoption of the Belhar Confession by the Uniting Reformed Churches in South Africa. So when the Dutch Reformed Mission Church merged with another denomination, that's the church they formed, they adopted Belhar. This is the letter that they included with it to explain why that confession was so central to them and what they meant by it. This is where I say to you, friends, the language around the call to unity is profound. Like, I am envious, not to say that it was perfect, but I am envious of the time that South Africa took under Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and many others to go through those Truth and Reconciliation hearings. We haven't done that. I mean, since the Civil War, since Jim Crow, since segregation in the 20th century, we have never had that level of honest conversation. And this letter is saying we put out this confession, not to say that we are good and closer to Christ and you are bad and have lost your way as the church. We're not saying that you're not Christian. We're saying that we desire to be one with you. But in order to be one with you, this is what we need. We need a reorientation. We need a reconciliation that is bound up in justice. The second letter that I do want to spend a little bit of time with, and I apologize because I'm going to be doing a little bit of reading to you. This is an accompanying letter from the 221st General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA on the occasion of the adoption of the Confession of Belhar. The sections of this that and I will also say, I really had to dig for this. I was telling Lynette, this is often not included in the Book of Confessions with Belhar. It's also important to note that when the Presbyterian Church voted to include Belhar, they said, yes, Belhar is a confession, but these are not. These are just accompanying letters that help us understand its context. This may very well be one of the best things I have ever seen come out of the Presbyterian Church. And I just want to share a few sections aspects of this that I think are incredibly powerful and challenging for us, and then I want to have some conversation about what folks heard. The Presbyterian Church USA is again facing a critical time in history. We are rent apart by division and schism. We have yet to confront directly and confess the racism that has been a significant force in our own history. And we have shown a failure of resolve to make a courageous stand for justice. We believe that the Confession of Belhar, a profound statement on unity, reconciliation, and justice in the church, comes to us as a word from God for this particular time and place for the Presbyterian Church USA. The Confession of Belhar is particularly helpful to our common life as Presbyterians for two reasons. First, it comes to us in a time of kairos in South Africa, when the church declared to speak with unusual clarity. It can help the PCUSA speak and act with equal clarity. Second, it focuses on the church's confession on its own life. It is far too easy for the church to look outside of its walls and find fault, all the while ignoring the sin in its own life. Belhar focuses the church's attention on the way its own life and witness have fallen short of the gospel. Later in the unity section. In South Africa, the system of apartheid, or separation of races, divided both nation and church into separate spheres. The Reformed churches of South Africa justified this division and developed theological rationales for its division so that blacks and whites were not allowed to come to the same Lord's table. The white settlers who came from Europe to the tip of the African continent came with a vision of a promised land that required either the removal of the native Africans or the separation of races for the sake of racial purity, spiritual well-being, and economic development. The spiritualized gospel adopted by the white church focused upon the saving of souls but had lost its prophetic word and mission for the healing of the divisions caused by human sinfulness. Reformed and Presbyterian Christians who came to a new world of the North American continent, and that's when you're like, oh boy, carried with them a sense of their own election and privilege. They too came to a, quote, promised land of new beginnings, seeking freedom and opportunity for themselves. They brought with them an understanding of the gospel that was not whole, that did not understand the completed work of Jesus Christ upon the cross, hearkening to the Confession of 67, and that called for the church to be visibly one. To complicate matters, in order to develop the new world's economic base, lands and workers were needed. Native Americans were removed from their lands, and African slaves imported to be a source of cheap labor. Human persons were oppressed, defined as property, and denied basic human rights. The church embraced a spiritualized gospel that justified the enslavement of people forcibly and violently captured and held in dehumanizing slavery for the good of white masters and landowners. Every aspect of American culture became divided. Slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person under the new Constitution of the United States. God's election interpreted as social privilege, became a theological justification for chattel slavery and racial segregation. Privileges based on race, wealth, gender, class, and power became institutionalized and legitimized. As a result, we have witnessed to the 11 o'clock hour of Sunday morning as the most segregated hour of life in the United States of America. We Presbyterian Reformed churches found ourselves in betrayal of the gospel of Jesus Christ in our own internal worship, fellowship, and witness. We continue to live under the specter of racism, classism, sexism, and division, which remain as enduring conflicts and challenges for both church and culture. The Confession of Belhar reaffirms the vision, this is under reconciliation, reaffirms the vision of mission articulated in the Confession of 67, that God in Christ has done what we could not do for ourselves. Jumping ahead, we American Presbyterians have not been able to fully confront our own past in regard to race. The fact is that both streams that came together to form the PCUSA, Southern and Northern, I know Lynette spent time with you last time unpacking that as it relates to our confessions. They use theology to justify permanent inequality in church and society. A theology that grew out of giving all glory to God became justification for divinely sanctioned inequality, particularly directed at African Americans. To fully embody God's ministry of reconciliation, we Presbyterians must confess that we have used God against others in our own church and commit ourselves to new patterns of relationship. Reconciliation implies repair of that which has been broken. Our verbal and written confessions, while important, are far less than adequate means of repairing harms done, restoring the losses, and reconciling the relationships that have historically been distorted. Concrete steps are required to produce the healing that we so desperately want and need. Reactions to that? How does that land with you?
Sounds like the prosecutor during your trial reading off the litany of what the accused were found or alleged to be guilty of.
What's the status? Is this approved by the church, this letter?
So this letter accompanied the Belhar Confession when it was brought before the 221st General Assembly. So it was approved as an accompanying letter, but has not been given confessional status. But like I said, it's hard to find this document. The reason why your page numbers are so weird was because I left out pages 1 and 2. This is the report and recommendation from that special committee. So I took off the first 2 pages, which had a lot of polity jargon and lists of people that were on the committee. So you just have the actual confession and the accompanying letters. But again, in preparation for this class, that was the first time that I stumbled upon this letter. I want to read one last section to you, and I apologize for this is a lot of reading. As Jesus launched his mission, the poor, the sinners, the wounded, the oppressed, the blind, and the tax collectors gladly welcomed him in. It was those whose privilege was threatened by transformation who rejected Jesus. They realized that he was turning the world upside down in a new day of justice and righteousness. As the ambassadors of Christ's reconciling love, the apostles, the sent ones, often meant resistance and persecution. Many gave their lives to advance the reign of God in their announcement of the good news of God's gracious presence and new life for those who repented and believed. We are being called to launch this mission again in our place and time. While the Confession of Belhar arose from the struggle of South African Christians to give witness to the gospel amidst the injustice of apartheid, we are also being called to give witness in the face of injustices here among us in the USA. We see that injustices in the face of thousands of First Nation peoples who still live in dire poverty on reservations, in young African American men who are incarcerated disproportionate to their percentage of the population, in the legal limbo status of immigrants, and in both native-born Latinos who are subject to questions in virtually every quarter of the nation, in public policies such as stop and frisk and stand your ground that put poor black and brown young men at risk in the public square. The Presbyterian Church USA confesses its commitment to God and to biblical principles of unity, justice, and reconciliation because in times like these in which we live, we need to remind ourselves and others of our discipleship to Christ and to follow God's mission in the world. If you have not done so, I encourage you to spend time with Belhar. Incorporate it into your devotional practices. Throw it on a reading list. It is not a long document. And simply sit with palms open, asking, what is this saying to me? What is this saying to us as the Westminster congregation? Because I can guarantee you it's going to reveal that we have work to do. And that is the very working out of our salvation together. Before I close this in prayer, I just want to ask, are there any questions or thoughts or things? Yes?
Thank you so much. This has been most enlightening and important discussion. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate. I'd like to know your opinion about the degree to which individual congregations around the country have had the opportunity or taken advantage of the opportunity to have good discussions of this either before or after it passed nationally.
In the lead up to the 2014 General Assembly, between 2012 and 2014, there was a big national push to get adult education resources, children's educational resources into congregations, to get sermon series, Bible studies going around this document. In the context that I was in, I did not hear this document read, right? It was lumped into a progressive agenda, to be honest.
And in the congregation I was in, there was a big discussion about
Right.
it,
Yep.
in a positive way.
And what they found was that the first time that it had gone up for a vote, when it did not meet the 2/3 requirement to add it, most people in most congregations hadn't even read the confession, right? And I realize that, like, for many of us, we have not read the entirety of the Book of Confessions, right? That's a lot to work through. But part of why we wanted to offer this little series was to say, these are terrific resources for us. And this is a big part of the reason why you see the affirmation of faith included as a part of the worship service, why we read those documents together, those words from our confessional repertoire, because things like Belhar, like Barman Declaration, Confession of 67, the short statement of faith, the Heidelberg Catechism, like these speak truth to us today, and they call us to a way of being in the world that runs contrary to and is subversive to how the world and our country operates. Confession of 67, Barman, Belhar. I offer these to you, we offer these to you as companions, as spiritual companions, guides, formation opportunities amid what will be a very, very challenging year for our country. And amid a time when it will be difficult to discern what it means to be Christian in light of a fractured church. And a church that is very much bound up in politics. Yes?
Are there any denominations or assemblies that you're aware of outside PCUSA adopted the Confession of Belhar?
That's a good question. It's actually answered in the brochure.
The RCA may have, I think the RCA has.
The Reformed Church in America in 2010, the Christian Reformed Church in North America in 2012 adopted it as an ecumenical faith declaration. Numerous Reformed churches around the world have also adopted Belhar in some way. Important clarification there. Yes?
Have you reached a conclusion as to why that letter was so hard to find, and what were, if any motives about, hiding it or making it hard to find?
Yeah, I don't want to go as far as to say it was hidden. Depending upon the version of the Book of Confession that you're utilizing, each one of the confessions has an introductory section separate from the confession itself to give context, right? But they kind of read like histories. This is more application, right? And I do think it is essential that the accompanying letter from the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, or what that grew into, stay with the confession, because I think you need to hear from the Christians in that time. Again, this is our only confession that arises from the global South. So their perspectives around why they are offering this as a gift to us is important. Now that said, like, there have been tremendous sermons, interpretations, applications of any of the confessions that don't make it into the printed book of confession. But this document that accompanied the Belhar when it was adopted, I think is significant and worth us sitting with.
I would just retract sort of my comparison with the Nuremberg trials, in that it's not an accusation as much as it's an invitation to take a look at things and proceed. And with a promise that it'll work out.
Yeah, we need like a good phrase for that. It's an urgent invitation. It's an imperative invitation, right? Like we say in, again, like justice work, it's not about calling out, it's about calling in. And I think that's what Belhar is doing. It is calling us to do better, to be better. But it's not saying you are bad, or you are not Christian, or you are not the church. It's saying we are the church, and collectively we need everybody to step into this work.
It brings to mind C67, with an urgency born of this hope.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Yes?
Just a point of information, in the study edition of the Book of Confessions, because you can buy so many different editions of the Book of Confessions, the study edition does contain both letters. And that's in addition to the historical introduction.
This one, which you can see is incredibly thick, even as far as copies of the Book of Confession go. Yes, absolutely. Yep. And I will say that this has a much more exhaustive historical context. And if you want to get into, I'm limited on time, but like tracking the journey of this confession, even just within our own denomination from 2002 to 2016 and beyond is fascinating, and why it faced the hurdles that it did. This gets into that in a little bit more detail. So, great. Why don't we close in prayer? Gracious God, you have shown us what is good: mercy, justice, humility. You call us to walk in light of the fact that your heart is closest to those who are oppressed, who are suffering, who are hurt, who are marginalized, who find themselves on the margins or at the bottom of structures of imbalances of power and privilege and access and opportunity. God, give us a spirit of hope and joy, not a fear of timidness, but of power, self-discipline, conviction, that we might move in faith and love towards you in this calling, that we might seek to discern collectively where we resist this evil, where we make our stand to advance the vision of equality and justice and unity and reconciliation to be found in your gospel. And so to the one and only God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, be the honor and the glory forever and ever.